Hey everybody, and welcome back to 662 Roundtable. I'm Nathan Foster, your host, my co-host Caleb Now, and we are recording a very special episode because we're not in our actual studio at the moment. We are not live, we're recording, but we are recording from the campus of the old alma mater, Freed-Hardeman University. We are super excited to be back. Caleb has already done all of his sightseeing. He's gotten in his lunch.
That's right.
Right about this time, he's normally going back to the dorm for a nap.
Yeah,
and so
keep me awake.
we're going to try our best to keep him going. But we're super excited about this episode. Our guest for today is a man who wears many hats, Dr. Ryan Frazier. Thank you so much for taking the time out of your busy schedule to talk with us a little bit today. Dr. Frazier is a professor here at Freed-Hardeman. He runs the Pastoral Care and Counseling program, which is a master's program here at Freed. He helps his wife with breeding dogs, and he's currently in the middle of a book tour. He's a brand new author of Overcoming the Blues is his new book.
Thanks for having me. It's great to be with you guys, and it's good to have you all back on campus too.
We're excited. And so let's talk about your book for just a second. I've read it. I think it's awesome. And I don't want to give too much away about the book, but you waste no time getting fairly real about some of your experiences, things that you and your wife have been through, which is good. And so just tell us a little bit about your book and what all it entails.
Yeah, Nathan, we tried to, well, first of all, just trying to find the right voice, for the book was challenging, and I've told people I've spoken to just about all the different iterations of this book that came out, different titles, different outlines, and just could never really find that right message or the way to connect it. And in fact, we were working on this book for probably about 5 years. On and off, right? And finally, just through a lot of rejections from different publishers, and with my people that have been good advisors and mentors to me, helped me find just an authentic voice, rather than talking in talking hypothetically in the book. It's real, and so I share in it a lot of my own family's story. My wife has been very courageous in her transparency, just with her walk with major depressive disorder, and just some of my own struggles, and then of course bringing psychology into it, bringing theology and God's word is very central. There's lots and lots of scripture in the book, and taking a different look at men and women of the Bible that weren't immune from depression, weren't immune from mental health challenges. So it's a book that's practical, but it's a book about hope, and really at the heart of the book is on finding joy and hope through serving others like Christ served. And so we're excited. We've been very excited about the reception of the book, both within churches of Christ and then outside the body of Christ.
Well, I think you would agree that it's a topic that affects a lot of people and is very much needed to be talked about. And one of the big things, the reason why we wanted to have you on is because of my personal opinions, is I think it's a topic that has an unfair stigma kind of placed upon it, and so we tend to view it as too delicate or something that's maybe over the heads of a lot of people, and we don't focus on as much the amount of people that suffer with this sort of thing. So Overcoming the Blues, you talk a lot about the clinical depression side of it, but also just this idea of feeling sad or worn down, and not necessarily when people hear the word depression, there are different levels of that, kind of like what your book goes through.
Yeah, we try to we cast a pretty broad net with it, because it deals with what I've come to call shades of the blue, right? So everywhere from just the normal bouts of the blues that people have periodically in their lives, might be situationally produced things that they lose a job or struggling in a relationship or something along those lines, all the way up again to the more clinical side of things where medication is often necessary and more serious psychotherapy and other needs. But most, when I say most, I think everyone I've ever met has had some connection with feeling blue at some point.
Yeah. Well, and that's one of those things, and it looks a little bit different for everybody that goes through it. And you mentioned kind of before we started recording that there's not really anybody that's ever immune to that sort of thing, whether you're a teenager or you're a new mother or those of us that even dabble in ministry. I got a chance to
dabble in ministry.
Dabble, okay. We all do our best, right?
Dabble, do you?
No, for those of us that are lucky enough to be ministers, and I got to work with very closely a guy named Jerry Barber, who I've talked about before on this, and great minister. Jerry Barber is very much a proponent of ministers who go to therapy because he sees a big need in this, in the work that we do. That's a lot. We are expected at sometimes to deal with a lot of stuff that is potentially over our head, and so we need somebody to release to as well.
Sometimes you can kind of look at it like as we're police officers in a way, because not necessarily we're breaking stuff up, but so to say is a lot of times we see the worst of the worst when it comes spiritually. You see people that are broken, you see people that don't have homes, and that's rough on us sometimes as ministers. It's things that we have to deal with and say, like you used the word hope a while ago, there's more, and not just for us, but our main objective too. So it's something that, like you said, we all have to deal with at some point in our lives, and how to handle that.
Ministers, by the way, we're going to dive into this just for a second, but I've done quite a bit of work down in Brazil with missionaries from all over Latin America with Great Cities Missions, but going down there, basically providing pastoral care and counseling to missionaries that flying for a week-long retreat. And man, just the struggles that, in that context, these are mainly North American missionaries living in Chile or Peru or Argentina, wherever, Brazil. And some of the isolation that they feel there, and they've got their own family issues and struggles, culture shock. So, you've got that level here in the States. A lot of ministers struggle to know who can I trust that I can speak to about my own challenges. And just a few years ago through Lifeway, with Tom Rainier, he did some writing on it, and they did some research, and they found, this is startling, but they found that people that are clergy members, so ministers, chaplains, and their wives, are 400% more susceptible to depression than the normal population.
Wow.
And part of that is like you're saying, Kerry, the things that we as ministers, and I also serve as a preacher, things that we're exposed to, that we see, but then also the expectations that we maybe put on ourselves because of our calling, our vocation, and maybe some of those external expectations that we feel like we're living in a glass house or in a fishbowl, and man, that can really wear on somebody where they feel like I've got to be the super Christian, but I'm just Ryan. I'm just me, and I can't save everybody. I can't fix their problems. I struggle with my own issues.
Yeah. Sure. Well, I think, that's one of those things that, we've kind of all hit on it. It's one of those deals that as you become a minister, part of what you're expected to do is take on the burdens of others, which I think is a biblical concept when you take a look at it. But at the same time, it's not for, if I can use a cliche, it's not really for the faint of heart. When you have to deal with everything in your own life and then take on the burdens of others because you feel this need to want to help others, and it kind of creates a little bit of a cycle. You've mentioned it. Your book kind of mentions that you cycle through that shades of blue. One of those. You've got your good days and your bad days, and then you've got your really scary days. And so that's one of the things that's a pretty mind-blowing statistic, though. The 400% more likely.
It is.
And I don't know that a lot of people realize that because for I had that happen to me last week. One of my girls said, "Do you have another job besides being a youth minister?" And I was like, "No." I was like, "This is my full-time job." She goes, "You must sleep a lot." And I, it was one of those things, and now granted, she was like a third or fourth grader, but she didn't really comprehend that, but it's one of those things that, I can see that. I just, when you put that number with it, it's kind of mind-blowing.
It is. There's just so many pressures on ministers and their families, and of course I talked about working with missionaries that are have some added stressors there, but
for sure.
We can be within the church. Sometimes church leaderships can be really hard on their ministers, and ministers can be really hard on themselves. We can be our own worst critics, and we maybe extend grace and mercy to everyone else except for ourselves. And so self-care is so important. If we're going to love our neighbor as ourselves, that implies we love ourselves too, and that we are taking care of ourselves, and we're finding time to recreate or recreate, but time to rest and be with our family and reconnect with God, even, because sitting from week to week preparing lessons to preach, that's not the same thing as rejuvenating yourself spiritually. That's two different processes.
It is.
Yeah.
And we've got to take care of ourselves spiritually, physically, emotionally.
Yeah.
All those ways.
You're kind of hitting on it a little bit. Your book kind of goes through some of the things that you suggest people do in order to help themselves. And I think that a lot of times when you have somebody who suffers with depression, whether it's a mild form or a very serious form, a lot of things that can help them, they just feel so bogged down they don't want to get to. And so we can kind of dabble in the maybe the whys of it in a minute, but
sure.
Go through without giving away too much of your book, because we want to encourage people to go out and buy the book, obviously.
Well, I appreciate that.
But it's
pay the light bill.
Yeah. But what are some of the things that you detailed specifically? And I know that the big one is service, but what are some of the things that you detail to help people get through their depression, and not even necessarily get through, but just have the ability to cope with it? Because I think a lot of us realize that depression is something that's always around. It's not something that you, at least for me, I don't know that it's something that you ever actually fully get over, where it's not in your life anymore, but there are ways to live with it and to deal with it.
Sure. Maybe it'll make sense if I start with what I call the 3 R's. So let me talk about that, then I'll break it down a little further. So the 3 R's, not writing, reading, and arithmetic. These actually all begin with R. So the first is recognizing God's abiding presence. We've got to start spiritually. So many times people that struggle with various mental health issues or physical issues feels like God has forgotten about them, or God's angry with me, or God doesn't care, or God's a million miles away. But that just isn't true. Jesus has promised us never to leave us, never to forsake us. That's even part of the Great Commission. I'm with you always. And then I think about verses like Psalm 34:18, that the Lord is near to the brokenhearted and saves the crushed in spirit. So there's so many texts like that. Romans 8, the tail end of Romans 8, nothing can separate us from the love of God. So again, recognizing God is there. It may not psychologically feel like it at times. Even on the cross, Jesus said, my God, why have you forsaken me?" As he cites from Psalm 22. But accepting and recognizing God is there. God does love me. And God's never going to love me any more than he loves me right now. Even in the throes of despair and depression or anxiety or whatever people are struggling with. So recognizing God's abiding presence. The second thing is to respect the second thing is to reach out to others, and we'll talk about that. That's serving, shifting our perspective. Jesus, for example, Matthew 20, verse 28, even the Son of Man came not to be served, but to serve and give his life as a ransom for many. So Jesus, in his ministry, he found and demonstrated purpose and mission and compassion through serving. It wasn't, he was always looking out the fields that were white for harvest and the laborers being few to go out into that harvest. And so reaching out and serving can take lots of different forms. Physical serving, it could be more emotionally, being supportive for somebody. And those of us that have struggled maybe with different types of mental health issues, we have a sensitivity. We are more sensitive to others around that may be going through similar things, because we relate to that experience and can connect in a deeper way than your average Joe can because of that. And I've worked in counseling with several elders and ministers over the years who struggled in their own mental health, and I've encouraged them, to stay with it, because they've got an insider perspective on this, and there's so many people in the pews in our churches that need that compassion and that empathy. So reaching out. Then the third is respecting our own limitations. So we've got, if you're dealing with any form of depression or anxiety, man, it takes a toll on your physical energy, your emotional energy, your spiritual energy. And so we need to recognize, hey, there's only so much of me to go around. There's only 24 hours in a day. I am not omnipotent. I am finite. Pride is the unwillingness to recognize our own finitude, our own limitations, and that we're not God, and so we're leaning on God, trusting in him, and respecting the fact that sometimes we've got to say no, and we can't do everything, and we might need to be on medicine in some cases. We might need to take better care of ourselves through exercise and diet and all those areas. So, I think, to say, here's the magic bullet, here's the silver bullet that's going to cure depression, I think that's very unrealistic. It's multifaceted, and it takes a holistic approach, thinking about, again, the 3 R's, and thinking about the importance of our relationship with others, with ourselves, with our God, and how God is central to that healing and that recovery process. So, rather than telling somebody, hey, read the scripture and get over it, we need to step back and realize again that this is multifaceted, and it takes a lot of compassion and patience and faith to move forward. Just because somebody, a Christian, is struggling with depression doesn't mean that they're faithless.
Yeah, and I think that's a big one, because I think too often right now we tend to look at somebody and you say, I'm struggling with something like depression, and I think a lot of times people's immediate response to that is, well, you should pray, or you should have more faith. And what you're doing when you do that is you're assuming that somebody hasn't prayed and that they don't have faith. And, in actuality, that person could very well be stronger spiritually than you.
Amen.
And they're just struggling with something different than what you struggle with. And it looks different. And so I think it's really unfair for us to say, well, you should just pray more, or you should just have more faith, and God will take care of it. I don't know that I buy into that, which is, part of what I love about your book is it gives you something to realize and to focus and hold on to, this idea of there are things you can do, aside from the, having faith obviously is a very important start of that process. Yeah. And, I just, like I said, for me, it's one of those things that I think it's because of that general mental illness stigma that we kind of, shadow over every sort of, anything mentally related. We just, well, you should just have more faith. And when you insinuate that somebody doesn't have that sort of faith, it really is kind of, call it what it is. It's actually really insulting.
It can be very, very damaging.
Yeah.
They're holding on by a toenail, and here we are criticizing them or kicking a dog when they're down. Yeah. Just like Job's friends did to him, They did their best work when they kept their mouth shut. Just sat there, hey, look, ministry of presence to him rather than making conjecture.
Well, I give way more credit to Job's friends than most preachers do, because I can count the number of guys on one hand that would come and sit down and not say a word for like 3 days.
Yeah.
And then you're right. Give credit where credit's due. They did do much better when they just sat there. But I like, again, same kind of thing that you're saying is it's difficult for us to be in those shoes, especially when you haven't felt something, because I think that's a big thing too. I think a lot of people that, and this is just my opinion, I think a lot of people that suffer with depression view that they can't be helped because the person trying to help me doesn't understand what I'm going through.
Right.
And I think that that's a barrier that, especially for ministers, that's something that we run into a lot, regardless of what the situation is, but especially when, you don't know how I feel, you've never felt what I feel right now, and again, because we're viewed as kind of like we've got the life where our faith is always a constant, right? Because that's how people view us.
We're always put on the pedestal.
We're always there. We're the super Christian. And I don't know why I do air quotes on the podcast. Nobody can see that.
It's like a little bunny foo-foo.
Right. We're supposed to be that super Christian. People are like, you can't possibly understand what I'm going through because you're you. And so I think that's a kind of a hindrance.
I'm sure glad that the Apostle Paul didn't think that, because we wouldn't have a lot of our theology on marriage that he wrote as an unmarried guy, but through inspiration. But I think connected to that, Nathan, people do feel very isolated and alone and feel misunderstood, and sometimes with good reason, right? Because maybe they've been judged by others and other believers, rather than folks are saying, hey, I don't really know how to help, but I just want to listen, and I just want to pray with you and be here for you in whatever way I can, rather than superimposing my own thoughts on the matter of what you should do to fix yourself.
Right.
That is seldom very helpful.
Yeah.
So I think a ministry of presence, like Job's friends when they were present, just being there. Jesus was incarnational. He showed up in person. If we can show up and be there for people and be a shoulder for them to cry on and say, hey, I'm not here to fix you or fix this situation, but I just want you to know that I love you, and I want to remind you that God loves you too, even in the midst of this pain, this maze that you find, this emotional maze you find yourself in, and if we can lend a hand to help, and at least an ear to listen to people, that's worth $1 zillion to them, just to have someone that will listen non-judgmentally and just say, look, I can't fix this, but I can sure pray with you, and I want to be here for you in whatever way you need me to be here with you.
Yeah,
that's one of the worst things, is bottling it up, as people, often do.
Yeah.
And I'm guilty of it. I let things build up in my life, and then don't tell anybody, especially those close to me. Even it's something that someone needs to listen, like you said, and be that shoulder, that ear. Because at some point there's going to be a breaking point.
Yep.
To where it's just going to come out, whether it's an emotional spot or something happens. and to be that ear,
Yeah.
to just be there.
Often, you said things coming out. Sometimes it comes out sideways,
True.
through anger or through
Yep.
some major breach. A lot of folks that deal with the blues, deal with depression and anxiety, they will do things as kind of as a way of escape. And so, for example, for ministers that get really tied into pornography or into extramarital affairs or into alcoholism, it's because of bottling things. No, excuse the pun, but bottling things up with alcoholism, and trying to find an escape, but looking in the wrong place. That's why the church, and especially leaders in the church, we need to be a safe place for people. That they feel like, hey, I can go and talk to my elders or my preacher, and they're going to be there for me, and they're going to be empathetic to me. They're not going to criticize me.
Right.
Because there's often a conspiracy of silence around depression, because there's so much shame, often stigma around it, and a sense of, if I was just a better Christian, I wouldn't be going through this.
Well, and I think that's a big key too, is we view it as, this is not something normal, quote unquote, to, that Christians should have to deal with. Christians deal with outside influences. We view the world being sinful, and I've got to, abstain from worldly things. And then depression, we don't view it as worldly, we view it as an internal thing, that there's something wrong with me. And I think one of the things, just, by the nature of what we do, one of the things that I personally struggle with is, you need somebody to listen. You need somebody to just sit there and listen. And, kind of like with Job's friends, you have to be able to balance the, okay, I'm just listening, but because of the nature of who most of us are, especially as ministers, we have to fight this urge to want to help and fix things.
Give advice. Unsolicited advice.
You want to be the fixer. Like that's, and I think that most ministers are kind of like that, because most ministers probably wouldn't be in ministry if they didn't like or feel the need to help people. And so there's kind of a balancing act with that. But I think, with depression, it's all that internal context. We think that there's something wrong with us, and that is not necessarily the case.
Let me say something on that, and I understand what you're saying, but I'm going to challenge it a little bit just for our people listening in. There is something wrong with us, with all of us. And obviously you shake, and that's, we're part of this fallen human condition.
Right.
And we're all subject to the collateral damage from the fall, from sin. And part of that collateral damage from sin in the garden is systemic evil that we deal with. But then even within our DNA, illness, physical illness, mental illness, addiction, all these things that, again, touch all of us in some way, either directly or indirectly. And I understand, of course, what Nathan was saying, that, that there's something inherently wrong, or that I'm abnormal, I guess, in that sense. But there is that sense, and I think we would all three agree that every one of us is broken in some way, but we're beloved. We're broken but beloved by God, which we're sons and daughters of God through Christ. And that, we don't have to be perfect. In fact, we can't be perfect.
Right.
But we're forgiven and we're beloved. And because of that, in God's eyes, we're beautiful as His sons and daughters.
Which is a really awesome concept when you think about it. And we don't generally break it down that way, but it's really an awesome concept to view things like that. And I think depression has a really funny way of being able to skew your vision.
Oh yeah,
and so
distorts everything.
We want to try to view everything as an optimistic person, you know, that I can use this to glorify God, and I can, you know, push past this, and, you know, people can look at me and understand that there is hope at the end of this tunnel. But when you're in there, and you're having to deal with stuff like that, whether it's, and you know, you could, just in the time we were here, you could look at 5 or 6 different faculty members that were having something, you know, pretty catastrophic going on with their families.
That's
right.
right.
Corley had a wife who was suffering with cancer. Ralph Gilmore's wife, Matt Cook's daughter. I mean, you had all of these people that were suffering with what the world would consider pretty catastrophic events going on. Yeah. And so for us to be able to look at them, and it's almost, you kind of want to walk that line, because it's almost like kind of insulting to walk up to somebody who's in one of the hardest situations of their life and being like, you know what, it's okay, because God's gonna look out for you. And you know, it's, and that may be very well true, but it's hard to hear in that moment and to understand.
The timing's not optimal.
Exactly.
For that sort of statement.
It's a bad timing thing, and sometimes we give the misconception that God wants that to happen to you, and in actuality it's the opportunity to glorify God through just a really bad situation.
Amen. You know, and goodness, God is given credit for a lot of things that is really Satan ought to be getting the credit for, you know, with sickness and cancer and, you know, all these different issues. But I'm always, when I have these conversations, I always think about Paul and think about his statements in 2 Corinthians about, you know, God, because of Paul's spiritual giftedness that God had given him, God allows him to have this thorn in the flesh, and it's never told what it is. So was it a temptation, or was it a physical malady, or a relationship? We don't know, and I'm glad we don't know, because we can generalize it to whatever. But I think if we think about Paul's statements there about, you know, God saying, my grace is sufficient for you, and my power is made perfect in weakness. You know, and so for the person that is depressed or struggling with maybe chronic fibromyalgia or some issue like that, to realize that God is not through with me. And through this suffering, this pain, I can be refined, and I can also be used in a very powerful way, because our faith shines the brightest in our darkest days.
For sure.
And I just hope, you know, that within the church we can not, rather than ostracizing those individuals that suffer and struggle among us, to view suffering, because every Christian, you know, as we walk in the footsteps of Christ, we are going to suffer. Jesus promised us that in John 16:33, that there will be trouble in this world, but he gives us the victory. Now, the victory in this abundant life in John 10:10 is not talking about the absence that we're gonna live life without any, you know, difficulties, obviously. But it's saying that we know that this is not the end of the story, you know, and that wherever I am today, this is not the end of my story. That God still has a purpose and a plan and a hope for me, as Jeremiah 29:11 speaks about. And again, like when you're having those, we've got the shades of blue, having a dark indigo day, you know. It can feel so hopeless, but it's those times that we can go back to our faith and to the author of our faith, Jesus, and let him be our compass to lead us home, you know, and at least help us with our distorted perspective, because you talk about having a skewed vision. That happens when we're
well, you start getting so far into this thing, and you just don't see a way out, and so everything flips from, to an extent, everything flips from being optimistic to not necessarily pessimistic, but a loss of hope to
Yeah.
the extent of what you're looking through. So, Dr. Frazier, in your experiences, what have been some of the big things that you see that cause depression? I know, probably health issues is probably one, whether it's death or sickness or whatever, and to not, never want to take a serious topic and make it lighthearted, but there are some things that people don't view as serious that may cause some sort of depression or at least a feeling of just being, really, really bummed, not necessarily just with something super serious like death or sickness, but if you're having, just you're stressed out over money, or you're a Mississippi State or Tennessee Vol fan, you tend to lose hope sometimes about.
Yeah, it is.
I said both. Thank you.
I know.
Well, the sources of depression and mental health issues is a myriad of places or triggers that can be there. I don't want to dismiss. I mean, we need to acknowledge here that there's often, not always, but there's often a genetic component. And so you can look at families and see where the depression gene seems to have run in a family.
Yeah.
And anxiety is the same way. And
Yeah.
we know bipolar, definitely. The research bears that out, that it can run. So, again, part of just as the human condition, we're all groaning for this deliverance, and
Right.
all creation's groaning, as Romans 8 talks about. But so we've got that element. But certainly, I kind of break it down, and I've come up with these 4 things. And this is, of course, since after writing the book, I've kind of thought about some things, but I speak about, and I've been able to share this in several places, and people connect to it. The first I call fragmentation.
Mhm.
We live in a culture that is fragmented. Our families are fragmented, broken homes,
Mhm.
right? Our faith is often fragmented so that God is not allowed in different compartments of our life, whether it's, so we allow God in at church on Sundays and Wednesdays, but on the ball field or at work or in our families. So that fragmentation. The second thing that happens along with that is it's kind of a correlated, but it's different. I call it saturation. So we're saturated with social media, with all these messages and these airbrushed lives that people post, of their vacation and how great everything is. It's not real. It's not the way your life really is.
Yeah.
So we got that, and we measure up to these impossible standards. But we're saturated with all these messages from the world. What's beauty look like? What does success look like? Or what does being valued look like? So we have those messages. It's very confusing to especially younger believers. Third is this idea of isolation.
Mhm.
Even though we've got all the social media and all this, people feel more isolated now than ever
Yeah.
in their lives. They feel like, maybe I'm connected to hundreds, even thousands of people via technology,
Mhm.
but I'm all alone. And people don't really know the real me. And if they did know the real me,
No.
would they really be my friend?
Yeah.
So we got that aspect as well. And my mind's going blank on the fourth right now. It'll come to me in a moment. But yeah, fragmentation, saturation, and this isolation that impacts so many of us in our culture. So I think a lot of it's socially and culturally impacted, and then within our broken families and some of the stressors and things that people have economically.
Yeah.
And it's hard to make a living
Yeah.
these days. So, I know what the fourth one is now. Expectation.
Yeah.
It is.
Unrealistic expectations
Yeah.
of ourselves. I was talking to a young person recently, talking about, once I graduate, this is what I expect to have
Right.
by way of a home or car or job. And I'll just shake my head going, yeah, that's unrealistic.
Well, and it kind of plays into, it connects to the realizing your limitations.
Yeah.
You know, having too high of expectations. I don't remember who it was, but a preacher one time he was doing a sermon. I think it was Spencer Furby, who's in Jonesboro, Arkansas at the moment.
Yeah.
I think it was him that said this. He said the American dream has ruined a lot of lives because people fixate on that expectation, even if it's not realistic. You know, people expect to have the American dream, whatever that looks like to you, with the house and the 3 cars and the beautiful family and the white picket fence, and you expect to have all that when
Sounds
you're 20.
like my life.
Yeah,
it really does.
Sounds like
Not.
you know, when you do that, but when you had those expectations as, you know, a 23, 24-year-old, you know, the American family that you always pictured wasn't like a young 20s family. It was like a 30s, 40s family, you know, and they've put in some work but the skewed expectation, I think, really correlates with the realizing your limitation, and how those things kind of, you know, obviously they work hand in hand, but when you lose one, you kind of lose the other too.
We talked about the American dream a moment ago. The American dream is not God's dream.
Yeah.
You know, and so we've, I think, blended our spirituality with this American dream. Jesus said, if you're going to follow me, if you're going to be my disciple, you're going to deny yourself, pick up your cross, and follow me. That's not an easy life in a rose garden. It's a hard life. And so, you know, the American gospel, if I'm going to use that term loosely, but is often this concept of, if I'm a Christian, man, if I give my life to God, then He owes me smooth sailing and all these blessings. Now God does bless us, but this life is not all there is. You know, we're looking towards an eternal home beyond this life, and in the middle of it, if we expect, you know, that everything's going to be easy and smooth sailing now, we're and our college students and our generation Y and Z coming through, the I generation, they're often in for a rude awakening. You know that. Life is hard, man.
Well, and I think it doesn't help that there's always that outlier. So everybody knows that one person that, and I think this might fuel depression as well, because everybody knows that one person that didn't work as hard as I did, that has way more than I do. And I think that, you know, kind of piles on top of everything when you start looking at, you know, people expecting this right away. Out of 100 people, there may be that one person that lucked out and got the great job right out of the bat, and you know, has way more than you do, and you think they don't deserve it. For me, it was always it was a college roommate of mine. It was the guy that, well, and it wasn't that he had more, it was that concept of you know, you could study. I could study for 5 or 6 hours for one exam and pull out a high B.
I know. I had
that
your class.
Awesome. And you know, yeah, right. But you know, you had a roommate who would you know, study his textbook for like 20 minutes and be like, I'm bored. Spend the next 2 hours playing video games and walk into the room and ace it. And it was just, you know, it's that kind of mindset that kind of burns you a little bit.
And here it is. I mean, life is not fair. There we go. Life is not fair, and if we have that expectation that life is going to be fair, we are going to be very disappointed and disillusioned, and depression is right around the corner.
Yeah,
because that's not the way it is.
Yeah. So let's for the last few minutes that we've got, I want to talk a little bit about, what do we do as ministers, or because your book is geared toward, I think it's either in the preface of the introduction of your book, it talks about this is a book for those who deal with depression, or those who work with or deal with or love people that deal or suffer with depression. And so what are some things that we can do? What are signs that we can pick up on to, I'm not going to say that it's our responsibility to prevent, but how do we help those who suffer with stuff like this, and what are things that we can do to make sure that we can do the best of our ability, that they have more good days than bad.
There's a lot that we can do in ministry, and as ministers, we're on the front lines. We have an access into a lot of people's lives that most people do not have, right? And so we serve, I think, such an important role in people's lives, and often have that built-in credibility and trust that's there. So I think just more broadly, and then maybe I'll get more specific, our opportunities, whether we're in youth ministry or pulpit ministry or education ministry, we need to educate our congregations about these issues and normalize it from the pulpit. I know when I'm speaking at different churches, people are coming up in droves afterwards saying, man, I wish I'd heard this 30 years ago. Yeah. Because, again, folks, they feel like they are so ashamed of their struggle, but to know that there are men and women in the Bible like David and Moses and Sarah and Hannah and Paul and Elijah, who was even suicidal. And these are great men and women of faith who suffered emotionally. So, and then to recognize that doesn't make you a less than Christian. That doesn't make you. So if we can help disseminate that message and preach it and be a resource for the whole congregation, I think that opens up some room. It opens up room and space for conversation about it. Mm-hmm. So at that level, I think having classes on some of these issues, and I'm seeing more of it now within churches where mental health issues are being addressed. It's so healthy.
Well, because I think it's I don't know that it's a bigger problem, but I think it's a problem that becomes more and more prevalent, and we see more and more people affected by it. And I think,
amen.
I think statistics, I think statistics reflect that, and whether or not we just have more information or more people are willing to accept it. If you look at research from 2000, like I was looking at stuff from 2013 to 2018, that number's gone up from like 12% to like 23%, which is a huge jump over the course of just 4 or 5 years.
It's unreal, out of all adult women, and this is inside and outside the church, but all adult women, about 10%. Struggle with some level of depression. 5% of men do. The statistics each year over the last number of years have increased 30% overall. All right, so worldwide, over 300 million people of all ages struggling with it. In the U.S., 18.8 million adults. Among teenagers, since 2013, the stats, and I know you've looked at these, but the stats, according to Blue Cross Blue Shield, at least reported for adolescents has increased 63% on depression.
It's crazy.
It's unreal, and a part of it is it's been spoken about more.
Right.
Yeah. But we need to, as a church and as leaders, pull our head out of the sand and be conversant in it and get educated ourselves. So I think that's a big part. Another part of it is just being making ourselves available. That not every minister is a licensed counselor, but you are definitely a counselor, at a ministerial level, to be present and to be helpful and to maybe help refer people and say, hey, if it would help you, I'll even go with you to your counseling appointment. I want to be there with you, and then putting some tools in people's hands, some different things that they can do to help. And part of that tool, some of those tools revolve around spirituality, and how our faith can be such a powerful resource.
Absolutely.
To serve, not as a complete antidote to it, but definitely to give us the strength we need to keep on moving forward and not fall prey to suicide, because we've had so many good men and women that have. And I think part of that was they felt all alone, and they felt very ashamed, and they felt that there was no hope, no way out, which that's a message from the devil. That's not true.
Yeah.
That's right.
That's not true. But we've got to talk about it, and we've got to make this okay to speak about. And
Yeah, that's one thing we have to understand, that that it is a problem, that it's real. Because look, we struggle with it.
Right.
I've struggled with it. When I was 19,
Mhm.
I didn't have to do medication or anything like that, but I struggled. I was at a low part of my life, and I had to realize I got to get over this.
Mhm.
I've got to get help, and some friends came in and helped me through that. But we have to get in our mindset and realize that our mind can sometimes be our worst enemy, as we talked about a lot earlier, and that this is real. But that just because that I'm down in this slump or I'm in this spot in my life doesn't mean I can't make a difference. You look back to when Jesus found out about John being beheaded. All right, it says he drew away by himself, and he wept. He was in an emotional different state, but then he comes back and he feeds 5,000 people.
There you
Show
go.
compassion.
Man, great illustration.
And
Love
it's something that just because I'm in a bad position in my life doesn't mean I cannot make a difference.
Mm.
And
You
it's
can't make a
something.
difference, or it doesn't mean you're going to stay there forever either.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah,
And
I
my
think
struggle
decent-
can help someone.
decent
We talked
cycle.
about earlier. Yes, 100%.
So I think that's a big one. I think that realizing that this isn't the end all be all thing that defines you. This is a struggle that you have, and it's a season of your life, right? And it's eventually
That's it.
going to get a little bit better and a little bit better, and then it may very well come back. And I think that helping us deal with depression now, but helping people understand that this may come back, and you need to prep yourself now to be able to deal with it in the future.
Sure, and as we develop coping skills, and some of those are psychological type coping skills, but others are spiritual, types of things that we do. And each at the end of each chapter, we've got what I call blue tasks for blue servants. So we may be blue, but that doesn't mean we're done with it. God, He's still working through us and is able to give us meaning and purpose even in the middle of our darkest days.
For sure.
He sure hasn't deserted us, and we can be such a great, I think, resource to others around us who may be struggling but don't have the hope that we are holding on to.
I think I'm gonna read you a verse here. It's kind of my theme verse now, because of the struggles that I went through, and I want to make a difference and try to be like Christ in everything that we do. I think of Isaiah chapter 61, and I'll just read the first verse here. It says, "The Spirit of the Lord God is upon me, because the Lord has anointed me to bring good news to the afflicted, and sent me to bind up the brokenhearted, to proclaim liberty to captives, and freedom to prisoners." And it goes on the next few verses. And that tells me I'm not alone, along with the many verses that you've mentioned, with a list full of more. There's hundreds out there. We aren't alone.
Yeah, mine has always been the God has not given us a spirit of fear,
Exactly,
but a power and of love and of courageous. And so I think that's a big one, realizing that you're not by yourself. As much as in that moment you may think you're by yourself, you're not by yourself. And I think for those that struggle and deal with this sort of thing, I think a lot of good can be done by focusing on that and then trying to prove it to yourself and picking up the phone and calling ministers, friends, family, and understanding that you're not by yourself. I think that's a big one. So
you got to reconnect.
For sure.
Right.
Sometimes we put ourselves in hybrid, kind of self-isolation, and but the body of Christ is here for us. God gave us Christ gave us this family to lean on, and I can't imagine not having the church as a family. Now sometimes some congregations might be slightly dysfunctional families,
right?
But we're trying to.
We've all seen our share of our share. So
we try to keep in step with the Spirit, and I just I'm so glad that you gentlemen are helping spread this message that we're not alone and that there is hope.
So we very much appreciate you being on. Before we have to sign off here, go ahead and give everybody, where can we find your book to purchase and to learn a little bit more?
Sure. Yeah. I mean, it's available through most major bookstore sites, so Amazon and Barnes and Noble and Christian books. So all of those, or you could just go to my website. That's RyanNoelFraser.com. And also through the Frida Hardeman bookstore, they're selling it here too. So, but just if you go on Google and just type in "Overcoming the Blues," it'll be I think the second thing that comes up. So it's there, and it'll lead you to where you need to go.
Well, good deal. Well, we very much appreciate having you on. Anything else you want to say before we have to close out?
Well,
last nuggets of wisdom.
I just appreciate what you guys are doing. I'm so glad that you're doing this podcast. We need this within Churches of Christ for sure, and I appreciate your ministry in Tupelo and Nathan and Amory, Caleb, and especially with youth, and our young people are definitely blessed to have men like y'all working with them. So thank you for your labors of love there, and I know you've got fingers in other pies too that you're working on. But thanks for interviewing me. This has been fun. Been a joy to be here today.
Thanks for letting us come up here.
Sure.
So this will go live, and again, like we say every time before we close, let us know what else you want us to talk about. People that you want us to come interview. I was actually kind of surprised. I just sent Dr. Fraser a text on I think it was actually Facebook. I was like, hey, we've got a small upstart podcast. Do you think you might want to speak on it? He's like, yeah, absolutely. I was like, sweet. Did a little fist pump and everything. But yeah. So thank you again for being on. For those of you that see this, go ahead and comment and let us know what are some topics that you think we need to tackle. We're not afraid to venture to just about anything. So until next time, guys, we'll see you.